For centuries, Earth existed on the edge of galactic awareness, catalogued as a marginal world with limited expansion, no stellar empires, and an almost embarrassing lack of visible megastructures, its people content, according to alien analysts, to trade, negotiate, and quietly improve rather than dominate. While other civilizations announced themselves through planet-sized shipyards, sun-harvesting arrays, and conquest fleets that blotted out stars, humanity focused inward, refining logistics, redundancy, and resilience in ways that looked inefficient to observers obsessed with spectacle. Galactic intelligence reports described the species as adaptable but timid, technologically competent but strategically passive, a civilization that survived by compromise rather than force. That misjudgment hardened into doctrine when Earth declined multiple invitations to join military blocs, refused to station fleets beyond its home system, and dismantled several prototype weapons platforms after internal debate labeled them destabilizing. To the wider galaxy, it confirmed what many already believed: Earth lacked the will for war. When tensions erupted along the Orion Spur and ancient rivalries reignited between expansionist coalitions, Earth was initially ignored, considered irrelevant to the coming conflict. That changed when a dominant alliance, confident and impatient, decided that neutrality itself was a threat, because a world that refused to choose sides could later choose to resist. The declaration was cold, procedural, and delivered through automated channels. Earth was to be occupied for stabilization purposes. Its industries redirected, its population pacified with minimal force. The planners expected compliance, perhaps some scattered resistance quickly crushed. What they did not account for was how deeply humanity had embedded contingency into every layer of existence. When the first fleets crossed into the solar boundary, Earth did not scramble fighters or broadcast defiance. Instead, global networks quietly shifted states, civilian infrastructure reconfigured itself, and millions of ordinary people received instructions that did not sound like panic, but like routine maintenance protocols long rehearsed. Satellites went dark not from destruction, but by design, removing targeting data while preserving internal coordination through channels the galaxy did not even know existed. Cities did not evacuate, they redistributed, population density flowing away from predicted strike zones as if guided by instinct rather than command. The invading commanders, expecting fear, found only silence and confusing data gaps, mistaking restraint for paralysis. Their first strike targeted orbital assets they assumed were Earth's defensive backbone, only to discover that what they destroyed had been obsolete for decades. Decoys maintained solely to shape enemy expectations. As occupation forces descended, they encountered no massed armies, no heroic last stands, only environments that refused to cooperate. Terrain that shifted, systems that failed at critical moments, supply lines that dissolved under relentless, precise disruption. What the galaxy failed to understand was that Earth had not prepared for war by building the largest weapons, but by ensuring that no single failure could ever end them. Every city functioned as a node, every citizen as a contributor, trained not to fight blindly, but to adapt, communicate, and endure. The invaders began losing ships not in glorious battles, but through cascading logistical collapse, their doctrines unable to cope with an enemy that did not seek confrontation but dismantled capability piece by piece. Panic crept into command channels as analysts realized too late that Earth's apparent weakness was not lack of strength, but the absence of ego. Humanity had never needed to prove power, only to survive whatever came next. By the time the galaxy recognized its mistake, the war was no longer something happening to Earth. It was something Earth had quietly absorbed, learned, and begun to reshape, not with fury, but with terrifying calm. The moment the galaxy realized the invasion had stalled, official language shifted from confidence to confusion, then rapidly to denial because no empire wanted to be the first to admit that a so-called minor world had neutralized multiple fleets without ever declaring open war. High command reports began arriving late, fragmented, stripped of context, describing crews lost not to enemy fire but to navigational failures, reactor misalignments, and supply convoys that vanished between perfectly mapped points. At first, these incidents were treated as coincidence or sabotage by third parties, until patterns emerged that could not be ignored. Every failure occurred where Earth's civilian systems had once interacted with galactic trade networks, places dismissed as harmless commerce nodes now revealed as deeply integrated sensory webs. Humanity, it turned out, had spent generations embedding itself into the galaxy's logistical bloodstream, not to control it, but to understand it. And when war came, that understanding became a weapon far more precise than any cannon. The invaders attempted to escalate, deploying heavier assets and initiating population suppression protocols, only to discover that Earth's social structures refused to fracture under pressure. Instead of panic, communities reorganized themselves into support lattices that absorbed damage and rerouted effort where it was needed most. Attempts to seize governments failed because authority was not centralized in a way occupation doctrine understood, and eliminating leaders only triggered automated succession processes that made command more distributed, not less. In orbit, a belated engagement finally occurred when a task force cornered what intelligence believed to be Earth's primary defense fleet, confident that at last the humans would be forced into open battle. The confrontation lasted less than 4 minutes, ending with the task force crippled by coordinated electronic disruption that left ships intact but blind, deaf, and effectively inert. What horrified observers was not the efficiency of the maneuver, but its restraint. Earth forces disengaged the moment the threat was neutralized, making no attempt to pursue or annihilate, as if destruction itself were a resource they refused to waste. Across the galaxy, younger species watching the conflict began to question long-held assumptions about power, noting that Earth seemed to treat war not as a contest to be won, but as a system failure to be corrected. Panic finally broke containment when a coalition stronghold, believed unreachable without catastrophic loss, found its planetary shields deactivated from within, not by infiltrators, but by legal and technical mechanisms humanity had helped design decades earlier under trade and safety accords. The fortress did not fall to bombardment. It was forced to negotiate, because its own infrastructure no longer recognized its commanders as legitimate operators. That was the moment the galaxy understood the true danger. Earth had not been preparing to fight empires. It had been preparing for complexity, for the kind of cascading chaos that large, rigid systems could not survive. Attempts to rally the galaxy against this insidious form of warfare failed as trust in centralized power eroded, species quietly withdrawing support, fearing they might be next to discover how vulnerable their own systems were. Meanwhile, on Earth, there were no victory parades, no speeches declaring supremacy, only continued adherence to protocols designed to minimize harm and restore balance, because to humanity, survival was not about domination but continuity. The galaxy had chosen war expecting submission or spectacle. What it encountered instead was an opponent that made aggression unsustainable, not through terror, but through relentless, disciplined competence that turned every act of violence into an argument against itself. By the time Earth finally spoke, the galaxy was already tearing itself apart. Not from bombardment or rebellion, but from doubt, the most corrosive force any civilization could face once planted. What began as whispers among junior analysts became open debate in senates and councils as leaders struggled to explain why a supposedly inferior world had not only survived invasion but rendered conquest strategically meaningless. Records were re-examined, assumptions questioned, and for the first time in galactic history, a consensus began to crack. Maybe power built on spectacle and intimidation was fundamentally brittle. Neutral systems started invoking emergency clauses to sever military integration, citing fears that their own infrastructures, designed under shared standards humanity had quietly influenced, might no longer be under exclusive control. The original coalition fractured along ideological lines, with hardliners demanding total annihilation of Earth to restore deterrence, while pragmatists argued that escalation against an enemy that refused decisive battle would only accelerate collapse from within. It was in this climate that Earth's message finally propagated, not as a threat or ultimatum, but as a clarification broadcast across open channels, translated automatically, stripped of emotional language, and devastating precisely because of its calm. Humanity did not accuse, did not boast, and did not demand surrender. Instead, it explained methodically, almost academically, that war against Earth had failed because it was built on false premises, chiefly the belief that humans valued dominance the way the galaxy did. Earth outlined its doctrine plainly: survival through redundancy, governance through distribution, defense through adaptability, and conflict resolution through minimizing irreversible damage. The message emphasized that no enemy fleet had been destroyed unless necessary, no population deliberately targeted, and no system permanently crippled unless continued aggression left no alternative. This restraint unsettled audiences far more than rage would have. because it reframed the conflict not as a heroic struggle but as a miscalculation humanity was patiently correcting. In response, several species publicly defected from the coalition, not out of loyalty to Earth, but out of self-preservation, realizing that systems capable of absorbing war without collapsing were also capable of enduring far longer than empires built on coercion. The hardliners made one final attempt to reclaim authority by launching a coordinated strike meant to overwhelm Earth through sheer scale, betting that even the most resilient system would break under enough force. The assault never reached its target. Logistics failed across multiple fronts simultaneously. Fleets stranded by fuel shortages traced back to contractual dependencies humanity had never advertised but had meticulously mapped, and command cohesion dissolved as Allied forces began refusing orders they could no longer justify to their own populations. When the remnants limped back, they found their political capital exhausted. Worlds that had once cheered conquest now demanded accountability, asking why trillions of lives had been risked to subjugate a planet that had never threatened them. Earth watched these developments without celebration, continuing to assist in stabilizing trade routes and restoring disrupted networks, even offering technical support to former aggressors willing to disengage. This was perhaps the most shocking revelation of all, that humanity's response to attempted annihilation was not vengeance, but repair. Across the galaxy, philosophers struggled to articulate what they were witnessing, eventually settling on an uncomfortable truth. Earth had not won the war. It had made war obsolete by exposing how fragile the structures sustaining it truly were. Younger civilizations began modeling themselves on human principles, decentralizing authority and investing in resilience rather than expansion, while older empires clung desperately to outdated hierarchies, hemorrhaging relevance with every passing cycle. By the time the last hostile fleet formally withdrew, there was no treaty signing, no triumphal declaration, only a shared acknowledgement, unspoken yet undeniable, that the galaxy would never again be able to dismiss Earth as weak, because weakness, it turned out, was not the absence of power, but the inability to adapt when confronted with a species that had quietly mastered it. When the war ended, it did so without fireworks or declarations, because Earth had never framed the conflict as something that required a dramatic conclusion. It simply stopped being necessary. Trade resumed along routes once choked by fear, diplomatic channels reopened with cautious humility, and worlds that had prepared for annihilation found themselves instead receiving repair crews, data packages, and logistical support from the very civilization they had tried to crush. Earth did not assume leadership of the galaxy, nor did it demand concessions or territory, a decision that baffled empires accustomed to equating victory with expansion. Instead, humanity proposed something far more unsettling to the old order: shared frameworks designed to prevent the conditions that had made the war possible in the first place. Standards that rewarded transparency over intimidation, resilience over scale, and cooperation over coercion. At first, participation was limited to smaller systems eager to avoid becoming collateral in future conflicts, but as those systems began to thrive, economically stable, politically adaptable, and remarkably difficult to destabilize, larger powers found themselves forced to reconsider. The galaxy's historians would later note that this was the moment dominance ceased to be aspirational, replaced by survivability as the primary measure of success. On Earth, life returned to its familiar rhythms, not because nothing had changed, but because humanity understood that continuity itself was the victory worth protecting. There were no monuments to battles never fought, no parades for disasters quietly avoided. The people who had kept networks running, who had rerouted populations, stabilized systems, and maintained calm under existential pressure, returned to their ordinary roles, content in the knowledge that what they had done would never make headlines. And that was precisely the point. Over time, the memory of the war transformed into a lesson taught in academies across species, not as a tale of conquest, but as a case study in misjudgment. The galaxy had mistaken restraint for fear, patience for weakness, and cooperation for submission. Earth's reputation shifted accordingly, no longer seen as a minor world or an emerging power, but as something rarer and more dangerous. A civilization that did not need to prove itself because it had already prepared for failure in every form. When future conflicts loomed, as they inevitably did, the question leaders asked was no longer who had the largest fleet, but whether their systems could withstand the kind of scrutiny humanity had endured without fracturing. And in that quiet recalibration of values, Earth achieved what no empire ever had. It made survival itself the ultimate demonstration of strength, leaving the galaxy forever altered by the realization that the most formidable civilizations are not those that rush to war, but those that make war pointless the moment it begins. Long after the conflict faded from immediate memory, after the last damaged fleet was dismantled and the final emergency protocols quietly archived, the galaxy discovered that the most profound consequences of choosing war with Earth were not written in treaties or borders, but in how civilizations began thinking about themselves. The old empires, those that had once measured legitimacy by how loudly they could project force, found their narratives unraveling as citizens asked uncomfortable questions. If domination invited collapse and restraint ensured survival, then what exactly had centuries of conquest accomplished? Educational systems changed first, subtly, shifting emphasis away from heroic expansion myths toward case studies and systemic failure, and at the center of those studies was always the same understated example: a planet that had been judged weak because it did not perform strength in recognizable ways. Analysts coined new terminology to describe what humanity had demonstrated, struggling to name a strategy that treated war as an inefficiency rather than a proving ground, eventually settling on phrases that translated poorly across cultures but shared a common meaning: strength through continuity. Earth did not police the galaxy, nor did it arbitrate disputes unless invited, yet its influence became unavoidable because any system designed without resilience now looked obsolete by comparison. Younger civilizations, unburdened by imperial legacy, adopted human-inspired frameworks almost wholesale, creating societies that could bend under stress without breaking, and those societies prospered in ways that made traditional powers increasingly irrelevant. Attempts to reverse the shift failed because the change was not enforced. It was chosen, repeatedly, by worlds that had watched an empire bleed itself dry against a planet that never raised its voice. On Earth itself, the war became something children learned about not as a moment of triumph, but as a reminder of how close misperception had come to catastrophe, reinforcing a cultural instinct to plan not for victory, but for recovery. Veterans of the conflict, most of whom had never fired a weapon, returned to civilian life carrying an unusual burden: the knowledge that they had helped stop a galactic war without ever being seen as heroes, and they wore that anonymity like a quiet badge of honor. Decades later, when a distant power considered testing humanity again, the debate never progressed past preliminary analysis. Simulations showed that even if Earth were defeated militarily, the cost to the attacker's own systems would be irreversible, a conclusion that spread quickly and ended the discussion without a single mobilization order. In this way, deterrence evolved beyond fear into foresight, because the galaxy had learned that attacking Earth was less like fighting an enemy and more like colliding with a mirror that reflected every structural weakness back at you. Philosophers would later argue that this was humanity's true legacy: not technological superiority or strategic genius, but the uncomfortable revelation that survival favors those who prepare for collapse rather than denying its possibility. And so, without banners or coronations, Earth took its place in history as the civilization that taught the galaxy its most enduring lesson: that appearing weak is often the first sign of a society confident enough to let its systems speak for themselves, and that once war becomes unsustainable, peace stops being an ideal and starts being the only rational choice. Centuries later, when historians no longer argued about who won the war but instead debated whether it should even be classified as one, the ripple effects of Earth's response were still unfolding in places far beyond human space, altering trajectories that had once seemed inevitable. Entire civilizations reorganized their priorities after studying the conflict, quietly dismantling doctrines built on intimidation and replacing them with models that assumed failure as a starting condition rather than an unacceptable outcome. The most striking change appeared in how the galaxy approached crisis itself. Where once every anomaly was met with escalation and force projection, now the first response was containment, analysis, and patience, a direct inheritance from the human refusal to treat chaos as an insult demanding punishment. Earth did not evangelize these ideas, but they spread regardless because they worked, and because worlds that adopted them endured disasters: stellar collapses, resource shocks, internal unrest that would previously have shattered them. Among the old empires, resentment lingered, not because humanity had humiliated them, but because it had exposed a truth they could not unlearn: that their greatest enemy had never been rivals, but their own rigidity. Attempts to return to the old ways repeatedly failed, as populations no longer accepted sacrifices made in the name of pride, having seen how close such thinking had come to annihilation. Earth, meanwhile, remained deliberately unremarkable on the surface, continuing to trade, cooperate, and decline offers of dominance, yet its influence was now structural rather than political, embedded in the architecture of interstellar systems that no longer functioned without assumptions humanity had normalized. Future aggressors learned this the hard way when limited conflicts elsewhere collapsed under their own complexity, proving that Earth's legacy was not peace, but the conditions that made reckless war impossible to sustain. Even long-lived species began to reassess immortality itself, recognizing that endless time encouraged denial, while finite lifespans demanded preparation, and in that inversion, humanity's so-called weakness revealed itself as evolutionary pressure refined into culture. By the time the galaxy faced its next existential threat, something vast, impersonal, and entirely indifferent to politics, the response was unified, decentralized, and astonishingly effective, not because Earth led the effort, but because Earth's way of thinking had already rewired how cooperation worked. Observers later noted that humanity's greatest contribution to survival was not any technology or strategy, but the normalization of humility at scale, the radical idea that planning for failure was not pessimism, but responsibility. And so, when future generations looked back and asked why the galaxy endured when so many others in the universe did not, the answer was never framed around heroism or conquest, but around a single quiet realization learned too late to forget. That the moment Earth appeared weak was the moment the galaxy chose to misunderstand strength, and that misunderstanding reshaped history more profoundly than any battle ever could.